I never forget it. You're also rid of the mix. I was pretty well finessed. You gotta let some things in the press. These guys don't understand. They have no understanding of politics.
He was one of America's most successful presidents on the international stage, lauded as a world statesman who thawed the Cold War. He was re-elected in one of the biggest landslides in American history, capturing 49 out of 50 states. Yet Richard Nixon was also the only president to resign from office, forced out of the White House in abject disgrace.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
40 years on, Nixon remains a towering, ruined figure. Who was the real Nixon? The visionary statesman or the sordid crook? I believe that's a false distinction. Nixon was both Jekyll and Hyde, a bizarre mixture of near greatness and incorrigible pettiness that left an enduring mark on history and makes him such an intriguing figure. This is the story of a man who remained a perpetual outsider, even though he rose to the very peak of power as President of the United States. With the help of rare behind-the-scenes footage, this film explores Nixon's tragedy, how the traits of personality that propelled him to the top also destroyed his presidency.
After you return, they're going to ask, well, what about this son of a bitch? And
in office, the ruthless, burning ambition that had forever driven him disintegrated into paranoia about enemies real and imagined.
Mr. President, I have Dr. Kissinger calling you now.
Fine. Hi, Henry.
The tapes he made of his conversations would expose him almost naked to posterity.
Who's got any other choice? God damn it.
Nixon's presidency, more than any other, shows us how the demands of the most powerful, most public job in the world can strip bare the character of a human being.
Get the very best agreement you can. That's all. Okay. Fine, Henry. Fine.
Here is an intimate portrait of a most unintimate leader. Nixon in secret, in his den, his hideaway office. A president alone with his visions and his demons. On the night of the 30th of July 1974, Richard Nixon could not sleep. Mired in scandal, his presidency was in terminal crisis. In the early hours of the morning, he took out his notepad and methodically listed the reasons why he should resign, for the good of his Republican Party and his country. Yet Nixon kept returning to his gut instinct that he had never been a quitter, and resignation would be taken as a confession of guilt. As dawn came up, Nixon had been scribbling for 3 hours. Finally, he turned over his sheaf of papers and wrote on the back, "End career as fighter." Richard Nixon had always been a fighter. To understand how this man became the most embattled president in history, we need to go back to the struggles of his early life, the struggles that shaped him. His father, Frank, a small-town grocer in California, was a violent bully. His mother, Hannah, was a devoted Quaker and homemaker. Yet the young Richard drew no real warmth from her. There were few hugs or kisses. Much of Hannah's energy was expended on his sickly brothers, Arthur and Harold, who died of tuberculosis. Richard grew up insecure, withdrawn, and emotionally bottled up. Yet these trials of youth spurred a fierce ambition. At school, Nixon was an ace student and strove for fame on the football field. But popularity eluded him. Dick seemed tense and solitary, always desperate for fulfillment, never able to enjoy his success. Some presidents exult in the trappings of power. Lyndon Johnson, Nixon's predecessor, started life as a schoolteacher in dirt-poor eastern Texas, and he loved to flaunt his status as president. On one occasion, he walked across the White House lawn to the wrong helicopter, and an aide rushed forward. Mr. President, that's your helicopter, sir, over there." Johnson turned round. "Son, all of them are my helicopters." Unlike Johnson, when Nixon became president, he didn't set up court in the grand Oval Office of the White House. Images like these were mainly for show on TV and in the press. Nixon liked to work in a far less ostentatious hideaway in the old Executive Office building a few hundred yards from the White House. Here, his typical pose was sitting in an easy chair with his feet on an ottoman, reading official papers or obsessively scribbling on his yellow notepad. The den was Nixon's natural milieu. Socially awkward, he shunned cocktail parties and business breakfasts. The den also shielded him from debate and discussion. Nixon liked to take decisions in private after reviewing memos and documents, rather than through the cut and thrust of face-to-face argument. This was a president who wanted to rule the world on paper. But a detached, loner president who secluded himself so much from bureaucrats and politicians, press and public, was particularly reliant on a few key intermediaries to do his will. His right-hand men were Domestic Advisor John Ehrlichman and Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman, known unaffectionately as the Prussians. In foreign affairs, Nixon's main interest, the man who mattered was the National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Up close, Kissinger caught something of the essence of his boss.
He didn't enjoy people. What I never understood was why he went into politics. Isolation had become almost a spiritual necessity to this withdrawn, tormented man.
Nixon himself admitted, "I'm an introvert in an extrovert profession." Not enjoying human company is a bit of a handicap for a politician. But Nixon had always compensated for his lack of personal skills by a formidable capacity for hard work. Hard work had been Nixon's way out of his impoverished small-town background. From his modest local college in Whittier, Southern California, top grades won him a scholarship at Duke University, one of the best law schools in the country. This should have been a huge boost to his self-confidence, but Nixon never let up. His grim determination earned him the nickname Gloomy Gus. One fellow student recalled,
A very studious individual, almost fearfully so. I can see him in the law library, hunched over a book, seldom even looking up. He never smiled. Even on Saturday nights, he was in the library, studying.
But there was a loftier side to Nixon's workaholic personality. He devoured history books, and was deeply moved by the lives of world leaders such as Woodrow Wilson and Winston Churchill. One of his cherished possessions was a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, a present on his 13th birthday from his grandma, under which she had inscribed lines from the poet Longfellow.
Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time.
Nixon was determined to leave his footprints on the sands of time. He saw himself as almost a philosopher president, envisioning the grand strategy while his minions sorted out the details. And in 1969, he came to office with a genuinely grand aim: to thaw the Cold War and reshape world politics. Since the Second World War, the superpower standoff between democratic West and communist East created the constant threat of all-out nuclear war. Tensions peaked in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which left Americans with a new sense of vulnerability and the whole world teetering on the brink of Armageddon. Nixon developed a plan to end the global standoff. To do this required détente, a relaxation of tension with Russia. But more than that, Nixon believed it essential to forge a new relationship with communist China. Since the communist takeover in 1949, the United States had refused to recognize Red China. In the 1960s, the xenophobic frenzy of Mao's Cultural Revolution gave further reason to shun the Asian giant. But although a right-wing Republican, Nixon swam against the tide. He believed that an opening to China was now vital.
We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors.
Nixon's goal was to pull China back into the international community because, he argued, the world cannot be safe until China changes. The boldness of Nixon's scheme shouldn't be underestimated. China was a total pariah. The equivalent today would be a Western leader calling for direct talks with Al-Qaeda. Nixon would act on this idea during his very first 24 hours in the White House, scribbling,
Chinese communists. Short range, no change. Long range, we do not want 800 million living in angry isolation. We want contact.
Here was the visionary side of Nixon, an American outsider reaching out to the world's outsiders. And what makes his initiative even more striking is that so far Nixon had forged his whole political identity as a vehement anti-communist.
New evidence of communist activities in government circles is promised by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Microfilm reportedly found in a pumpkin on a Maryland farm is examined by investigator Stripling and Congressman Nixon.
Capitalizing as a young politician on the Cold War panic of the 1940s, he relentlessly depicted his opponents as crypto-communists. Running for the Senate in 1950, he smeared his rival Helen Gahagan Douglas as pink right down to her underwear. When in a political fight, Nixon showed little sense of restraint. He simply went for the jugular. Nixon